So apparently there's a little bit of drama around the map sizes in BO6. I think most people thought they were a little bit smaller. And apparently Nero Cinema put out a video kind of saying how big they were or how small they were. And I think Exclusive Ace is kind of delivering some information maybe as a debunk. At least that's my general idea of what the video is about. See, accurate scale. And we'll go ahead and check it out and see what it says.
What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be taking a really deep look at the maps we're going to be seeing for launch with Black Ops 6. More specifically, we're going to be looking at the sizes of these maps and comparing them to known maps like Nuketown and Raid. And initially I wasn't going to do this video, but I really feel the need to correct a lot of misconceptions that are now being spread around the community, specifically from a video that Nero Cinema made a few days back.
And a side note on that is I think it's kind of one of those things that obviously Nero's not doing anything malicious, but this happened also before. I think he made a comment on Twitter about health regenning being incredibly slow for this game. And then I think Exclusive Ace came back and hit him with the facts that they're not particularly slow. And we've had other games that are much slower. So it's not that like Nero's trying to spread misinformation. Sometimes we misremember things, and sometimes you could be misquoted, and misinformation spreads like wildfire in compared to the truth sometimes, because a lot of times people might already think one thing, and then when somebody says it, that just kind of validates that opinion. And we have this happen all the time. Misinformation gets spread wildly, regardless if it's close to accurate or completely false. And we've seen it happen multiple times.
Now, to be clear,
intentional
I like Nero.
or not
no
intentional
with Nero whatsoever. So this isn't me trying to start beef with him or anything, but his video that he made was wildly inaccurate, as he was sharing map size comparisons that are so incredibly far off in some cases that it's misleading people. And I'm noticing a lot of the comments on that video are essentially just piling on with that criticism based on false information. And I do think this is starting to spread a little bit, and it's actually turning some people against the game, which is frustrating. I have no issue if you don't like the game or you don't like elements of the game. I think we should be critical. We should speak up when we don't like something. In fact, I said it in my feedback videos, I do think the map selection we had access to in the beta was a little bit underwhelming for Treyarch. I tend to have slightly higher standards for Treyarch when it comes to the map design, so I think it's totally fair to be critical of the map design in the game. And if you don't like it, speak out. That's totally fine. My issue here is backing up and spreading criticism based on completely inaccurate information.
And again, this happens all the time. There's some channels out there that intentionally do it in bad faith, and there's sometimes people do it by accident. Obviously, Nero's probably doing it by accident, just to feel, but it doesn't matter. The information gets spread, and it gets spread wider than maybe even this video will go. And it happens. It's part of content creation. We don't have fact checkers, right? So we're not able to address things, but it's good.
So again, this
Exclusive Ace is kind of addressing that
be tearing apart his
misconception
pretty harshly here, because his map size comparisons were way off in most cases, and there are ways of doing this much more accurately than what he did. And just a recap of what he did here, he found the grid lines on the map overviews that we got, and he matched up those grid lines. And admittedly, I was initially going to make a video based on that, but the moment I started matching them up, I saw some massive inconsistency.
Yeah, because a lot of times the grid squares in one game, and even on different maps, we saw the same thing with Rebirth Island, Fortune's Keep, Verdansk, comparing those to Caldera. You get some wildly different measurements, even when you compare it to Blackout. A grid square, you kind of have to figure out how much a grid square actually is. You can't just line them up. Although you would think, hey, they use the same thing, but sometimes there's an aesthetic choice to kind of make it fit a boundary, not necessarily make that boundary. It's weird. It's on the developers. It should be lined up, but then maybe we'd have things that don't look proper when they need to put them in an overlay.
Should not be the size of a house, for instance.
Yes.
So it was pretty clear that those grid lines were inaccurate. It appeared Nero didn't pick up on that, and he just ran with those grid lines, and that's why he ended up with such wildly inaccurate results. So I don't think he like purposely skewed things or did things maliciously here. I think it was just an honest mistake.
Oversight.
And he didn't really take a close enough look at this before running with it. So let's dive into these comparisons, and we're going to focus on the beta maps first, because with these, I can actually get very...
I'll also do a side note on this one too. I know I'm stopping the video a bunch, but I got to explain content sometimes. And this has happened before, even for myself, where I'll go through and I'll measure something, and I'll remeasure it, and something seems just off. Like off more than like common sense. It just says, you know what, this doesn't add up. Before I make the video, I might message, True Game Data or Exclusive Ace, depending on the specific topic, and be like, I ran into this. And then they might either validate what I said and be like, oh yeah, you're right. It's either bugged or off or something. Or the opposite, where it's like, well, I got this. And then I figure out how they got that. and then I can find where I made the mistake. And I think this is a pretty common thing, especially it's unspoken, but myself and in True Game Data and Exclusive Ace and anyone who's putting out information, we're just held to a higher standard. Whether that's fair or not, we are. So people will nitpick and find a problem in what we talk about just because we're held to a different standard than everybody else. It's not fair, but that's part of content creation, I guess, when you get into the data-driven content.
Very accurate information because we have exact distances on those maps, and I can calculate exact distances on known maps like Nuketown and Raid from Cold War, and we can compare those all side by side. So here we go. Here's all the core maps compared to Nuketown and Raid.
Okay, let's go ahead and pause this. So the smallest, obviously, is Babylon, 22% smaller than Nuketown. Rewind, it actually has a pretty long stretch there, about almost 3.5 times longer. Protocol, Nuketown, about 107, but it's not very wide. Nuketown. Raid is kind of huge, huh? And then he measures it by pixels, and that gets confusing too, because you get these square pixels and pixels squared, and it could be really confusing on some of these things. Skyline, and then Derelict. So he just kind of put an 80 on there to keep it simple, where you could ping.
Using exact distances and scaling everything perfectly to the nearest
without
pixel.
the grid squares.
And just in case you guys are wondering how I found these exact distances on the beta maps, in Domination, you can see exactly how many meters you are
far
away
flag.
from the Domination marker.
Yep.
So I would just scroll through my gameplay, find a point where I can see that distance marker, take the exact location that I was standing on the minimap versus the exact location of the center of that flag
Makes
marking.
sense.
And there we go. We got our exact
2
distances
points,
there.
create a line.
And you'll also notice with Nuketown and Raid, I calculated the total amount of pixels within this particular image, which is scaled appropriately. So we get our total playable footprint size of those maps, and then I just calculated how much bigger or smaller all of the beta maps were relative to Nuketown. So Rewind, for instance, is roughly 3.4 times larger than Nuketown when it comes to total playable footprint. Babylon's actually 22% smaller when it comes to the total footprint. Skyline.
So I'm guessing Nero said that these maps are smaller than Nuketown, which is clearly off. They're all larger. Most of them are 1.5 to 3 times, right? To 3.5 times?
Well, it has roughly the same length of Nuketown. It does have a bit more width to it, and therefore it's actually 1.6 times larger than Nuketown in total playable area. And again, that's just the footprint. We're not looking at the multiple levels and everything too.
Yep.
And even Derelict is a bit bigger than Nuketown when it comes to that playable area. And one of the ones I wanted to focus on here, because it's one of the ones that Nero covered specifically, is Protocol. And this is just to show how far off some of his measurements were here and why none of them can really be taken seriously. With Nero's comparison using those grid lines, you can see that Nuketown is apparently noticeably longer than Protocol overall, and it covers almost all of Protocol. And if you consider the areas of Nuketown that are going out of bounds on Protocol, overall, it appears that the total playable area of Nuketown is actually larger than the total playable area of Protocol. However, with the proper comparison, using the exact distance measurements to the nearest meter, you can see Nuketown is quite noticeably smaller than Protocol.
Way smaller.
In fact, you would have to scale up Nuketown by 45% versus Protocol in order to get the image that Nero ended up getting. And that is far from just a minor mistake or a little detail that's slightly off. That is wildly misleading. That is so far off. And for anybody that went into the training area on Protocol throughout the beta, it was immediately obvious that that map is noticeably bigger than Nuketown. It's not Nuketown small. Now, I'm not going to call it a super large map by any means.
That also goes back to kind of what I was saying. There's not really a checks and balance in content creation. People can really put out whatever they want. I could just make the same video as Nero. I could make up numbers. Not saying he did that, but I'm saying I could do all these things and I'll probably get called out for it, but people will believe what we're saying in the video, right? And this happens a lot. There's some people that say certain guns are overpowered or broken or meta, and they're trash guns. We know this. Those videos are put out there for entertainment purpose. They're not necessarily there for you to get value from the creative class or the weapon stats or any of those types of things. So you got to kind of take the media in and figure out what's the purpose of the video. And in this particular case, it seems like Nero was way off, but there's no checks and balances. And this ends up being a form of it because Exclusive Ace is addressing it because he saw it as an issue. He got asked about it.
But it is absolutely very noticeably bigger than Nuketown, and it is what I would classify as a media map in Call of Duty, just like Treyarch did. So there we go. Those are the comparisons versus the beta maps where I have really nice measurements to work off of, and I'm super confident in these results. From here on out, we are going to go through each of the individual core maps that are coming at launch that we didn't have access to in the beta.
They teased them, but we won't know the hard distances.
While I am confident that I've got significantly more accurate results than what Nero showed in his video for these maps coming up, they are not necessarily going to be as perfectly accurate as
because you don't have the
maps,
scale,
especially with certain maps where we don't have too many comparable assets. And that's how I was able to find the rough scale of these maps. Based on the images or little clips that we've seen on these launch maps, there are certain assets that are shared across some of the beta maps. And therefore,
trash cans, buildings,
scale that to the best of our
boots,
ability
cars.
appropriately with those, then we can match them up with Nuketown and Raid again. And let's just start this off with Vault, since this is an easy one, since we actually have the exact same van asset on the map Rewind as we're seeing right here on Vault. So if we match those ones up perfectly, we can see Vault is roughly 3.38 times larger than Nuketown when it comes to total footprint. And again, I think I would safely classify that as a medium-sized map. Next up, let's have a look at Vorkuta, and in Nero's video, he compared this to Raid rather than Nuketown. And also, when he scaled the difference between Raid and Nuketown, he was about 15% off on that one as well. But in either case, when we look at it here, we've got a shipping container on Vorkuta that is the same width, at least, as the shipping container on Derelict. So I was able to match up those assets. And as we can see here, it is very clear that Vorkuta is a larger map than Raid, unlike what Nero showed, where Raid would have had a noticeably larger footprint. That's simply not the case. In fact, Vorkuta is about 1.21 times larger than Raid based on this testing. Next up, we have Lowtown, which is apparently the size of Nuketown, or maybe even slightly smaller than Nuketown. However, based on my measurements here, using the length of a van that was tipped on its side compared to a van on Rewind, Lowtown is roughly 2 times larger than Nuketown when it comes to total playable space. After that, we have Red Card, which, according to Nero, this is noticeably larger than Nuketown. You could probably fit about 2 Nuketowns within one Red Card.
Maybe if you change it angled.
However, if you scale this based on the size of a van once again, Red Card is actually about 3.5 times larger than Nuketown.
So we're seeing kind of a common number, like give or take, this 3.5-ish number, or 3.4 to 3.5. It seems like that's probably the measurement that they're aiming for when it comes to a medium map. When it comes to all these areas, it feels like most of these have been falling within that line of 3 times larger, whatever that square floor, inch, pixel, whatever you want to call it, ends up being roughly around those sizes. Then they build off a 3-lane map with multiple levels, and boom, then you got 3 points where the Dom flag sits or whatever. So pretty straightforward.
Not just roughly twice as large. And that wraps it up for the maps that Treyarch listed as medium-sized maps coming at launch. And I would say, so far, the descriptions for those are all perfectly accurate. I would classify every one of those non-beta maps that I just went over as medium-sized maps, just like Treyarch did. Now let's talk about the 2 small maps, and these ones are quite small. Also, the assets on this one, I didn't find a perfect match for these assets on any of the beta maps that we played.
It's the hard part. When a small map is not going to have as many assets.
Being perfectly accurate goes down even more with these small maps compared to the ones I just covered. So let's start this off with Subsonic, and this is Nero's image of Subsonic with Nuketown laid over top. And this is the measurement that I got with Subsonic, roughly comparing 2 APCs, which appear to be slightly different assets. So therefore, I'm not 100%
I don't know. That one's hard.
It
looks
sizes are perfect, but it should
more
be
like
at least quite
the Babylon
close.
map, right?
And it turns out in this case, this actually looks pretty similar to the results that Nero got using the grid lines. So I believe on Subsonic, the grid lines were actually accurate to the comparison map that he used, which was Warhead, which is one of the face-off maps. So when it comes to Subsonic, yeah, it's a small map for sure. It's a very small map. It is worth noting, still with this comparison, the total playable space, since it is more of a square map, is actually very slightly larger than Nuketown. And that's because
slightly.
Nuketown is more of like a long, skinny map compared to Subsonic. But as far as distances from one end of the map to the other,
not doing long shots on that map.
Significantly smaller than Nuketown. And this just leaves us with Payback, which is another small map. And this is the image that Nero got with Nuketown overlaid on top of it. And with this one, I am the least confident since there were no assets that lined up perfectly. There was a cargo truck on Babylon and a cargo truck on Payback, although the length of that cargo truck on Payback looks to be noticeably longer. So I was trying to basically just use the width of this. So with this one, there is a fair amount of room for error on this, but this is the results that I found. And if anything, it appears.
If that map is that small, that's crazy. Because Babylon's 22% estimate and then 40%. Obviously, there's a big room for error, but holy, that map is going to be tiny.
Payback is actually very noticeably smaller than Nuketown. Although intuitively looking at this, I do feel like I scaled this down a little too much.
Too much, yeah.
I'm sticking to the exact same method I used for the other ones for consistency's sake here. And it appears Payback is actually noticeably smaller than Nuketown in not only length, but also playable area. So just like Treyarch stated, when it comes to those 12 6v6 core maps at launch.
Yeah, because Babylon, if we look at that, you can actually see right here. I would say that, like, if you made Babylon even more narrow to stretch it out, I don't know. That's kind of crazy.
But also playable area.
Interesting.
So just like Treyarch stated, when it comes to those 12 6v6 core maps at launch, 8 of them are going to be medium-sized maps, and 4 out of those 12 will be smaller maps. And here's all of the maps put together to scale to the best of my ability here, with Nuketown and Raid as a reference in the top right corner. And overall, when it comes to these map sizes, I've said it before and I'll say it again, as much as I don't generally like playing large maps on a regular basis, I do always like having like 1 or maybe 2 large maps mixed into rotation just to break up the monotony a little bit of these small to medium-sized maps. Ideally for me, I do prefer the more medium-sized maps, and it looks like we're getting quite a few of those in this game. And I also don't mind.
And generally, why, obviously each map serves its own purpose. Small, it's just more frenetic gameplay, they always call it. It's fast paced. You get in the action instantly. The more actions per second, per minute, whatever, is way faster. But you're kind of more on autopilot when it comes to a small map. More of a medium map, you get to actually use your game sense, game knowledge, look at the mini map, track spawns, repeat, hold anchor, do map control. There's actually elements that are important for Call of Duty, and then obviously big maps are an extension of that, and they maybe add to more weapon variety, especially in the long range, be able to snipe. Versus small map, you got to be a little bit better if you're going to be sniping, especially
in the small
if it's
meat grinder
fast
maps
paced.
Too much.
Yeah.
As long as they don't
You call
show
it a
up
meat
too
grinder,
often,
but
and that's
yeah.
generally my issue with these small meat grinder maps, is when they pop up to be voted for, they tend to win the votes.
Yep.
And especially in a game like Black Ops 6, where we have a face-off playlist where it's 6v6 on 2v2 maps essentially, with no score streaks and everything involved. I was kind of hoping that would mean that we would see fewer of those really small meat grinder maps for core modes, but it does look like we're going to be seeing at least a couple of those.
And we get
at launch,
Nuketown on
those, of
November
course, being
1st,
Babylon
so
and Payback, and then I fully suspect they're going to be adding Nuketown shortly after launch, since that is a trend that
Before
we
he
tend to
knew,
see
it's a
with
week
Treyarch
after
and Black
launch.
Ops games. And there we go. That's pretty much it. As far as the quality of these maps go, especially the maps that we haven't played yet, I really just want to wait and see. I did share some of my thoughts and opinions on that in a video last week, just based on the overviews, but you can really only gather so much based on overviews, and I really just want to get my hands on it and see how they end up playing out. And with that, I was going to wrap it up for today's video, and this is...
So go ahead and check out his video. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Are you surprised that the maps are as big as they are? That they're actually much bigger than Nuketown in a lot of cases, 3 times? Or do you think that they are smaller, like more like Nero's thing? Obviously, I'm going to lean towards more the analytical side. Appreciate all the support on the video. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.